All right, welcome everybody back to another episode of the Big Doug and Carmi Show, your one-stop shop for all things Commanders. It's a Inside the Command Center Friday. We're trying to get you a little closer to the action. To do that, from the Team 980, Craig Hoffman is our guest today. Craig, what's happening, buddy?
What's going on, boys? Good to be with you. Sorry, I should have worn a hat. I realize this now. We've started the show, and I realized that I'm hatless, and that is apparently a requirement for the show. So I apologize to everybody.
Well, if we had hair like that, Craig, we'd go
Exactly.
hatless
It's
too.
flowing, very flowing over there, Chris.
Just throw it on here to hide what we don't got.
Try to keep it out of my face, and make some sense, and have a Friday.
There you go.
Craig, we're not having to worry about who the next head coach is, or the next GM, or the next quarterback. Like, what kind of world is this? Is it real life?
It is real life. This is what football is supposed to be. And it's funny how much you realize you don't know or you forget about covering a good team. It's like, oh, yeah, these are the things that are supposed to happen. This is what competency look like. This isn't revolutionary. This is basic. This is baseline. Now, some of the stuff that the Commanders do and the way Adam runs things, and obviously Josh has given them tremendous resources. And, Dan, I think, is doing some really special things from the head coach position. Obviously, we can talk about players who are doing really special stuff. Some of this is pretty special, pretty ridiculous, pretty historic in some cases, Kingsbury-Daniels, to be specific. But some of this is pretty baseline stuff that we've just been missing for 5, 10, 20, 30 years. And it's very nice to see. And lo and behold, when you do it well, you can be an 11-win football team, which is probably why every team has done it in this century, except for Washington, until this season.
It just makes you realize how crazy it was with Dan here to kind of take a look back and see what it was, see what it is now. And I think it's the one thing I guess I didn't see coming. And I think this has been really cool for the guys that have not just for the guys that have been here, but even guys that have come in, and how much they've realized how hungry the fan base was, and just how you can kind of see the fan experience and what they're giving back to the players grow as the year goes on and the legend of Jaden Daniels continues. And I got to say, it's been more, this sounds funny to say, but it's been more exciting than I realized it would be. Like, it has been something special, and everything has just kind of come together and worked.
No, I think that's really well put. And there's probably some pretty deep psychology involved here, even getting into a lane of trauma. And I don't know how much we want to apply the term trauma to fan base. We're all rooting for football, but it is something that people care deeply about. And so there's a deep emotional connection. And so some of the inner brain workings are probably the same. And there's the learned hopelessness is kind of the psychological phenomenon that we would be talking about here. And yes, I am reading a book on psychology and trauma right now. Why do you ask? But on a much less serious, the stakes much lower level, there is such thing as learned hopelessness. And they've done all these experiments that are kind of terrible with dogs and stuff, where it's if you electrocute the dog and they won't even, and then you open the door, some of them that haven't gone through that experience before will be like, oh, I can get out, get me out of here. And if you repeat that experiment enough times in certain ways, the dogs just learn hopelessness. And it's well, I can't do anything. And they just shut down. So there's probably, that was a very intense way to say, there's probably parts of our brains and the fan base at large that have given up the idea of having hope, because why would you? And I think even some of those people probably argued with me on the radio or in YouTube comments or whatever about how much an ownership change would really matter, because you don't realize that that's the thing that's driving the bus, is that when you have a bad owner, he hires a bad president, who hires a bad GM, who hires a bad coach, who hires, and some of these aren't even bad, inferior, let's say, or doesn't get the best out of any of these people. You're just never going to get the best out of anyone, because you always have weak links in the chain who are not good leaders, who are not good at deploying resources, who are not good at whatever, or don't even have the resources in Snyder's case. So that, I think, realization somewhere deep inside, where I think so many fans knew, even if we can get a good quarterback and have a blip of a year or a couple year stretch where we're competitive, eventually it's going to get messed up, because say we get RG3, that whole situation's mismanaged. Okay, well, they had the backup in Kirk, and it turns out he might even be the better player. Well, then they mess up the contract, and then on down the list. And so I just think that hopelessness would probably sunk in a way that some people are still having trouble shaking off. Some people are still saying, I don't know how much I believe in this long term. I have too much RG3, Stockholm syndrome, whatever. And the reality is it's just a different operation, and it's because the owner's different, and then all the people he hires down the chain are obviously making the huge difference day in, day out.
Greg, I think you nail it, right? Because I feel like a lot of us in our fan base haven't seen success in Washington most of their adult life, right? If you're like a 25-year-old, like if you're in 1999 was the last time Washington was significant or had any improvement, now seeing this team, showing some signs of life, we don't know if it's going to sustain long term. My question to you though is, being on the beat a couple of years ago, you were there during the Dan Snyder era. What are some tangible differences that you're seeing, right? I feel like from my perspective, it seems like the front office, seems like the coaching staff, and even Josh Harris is providing resources, as you kind of alluded to the actual regime, right? Like we're starting to see a flushed out front office staff, a flushed out coaching staff. What are you seeing behind the scenes with, the differences between Harris and Snyder, in your opinion?
Yeah, I would love to take like a tour of the facility in Ashburn now, which I'm at it during training camp, and I try to pop in once or twice during the season. This year I haven't been able to because like the times that they have the pressers and the time of my daily show are in conflict in terms of getting back and forth, especially because I both live and work in the district, and Ashburn's not particularly close. But I know for a fact when I was on the beat that getting very basic, for instance, recovery tools was like a big deal. And I remember some members, because I work in the strength and conditioning world as well, like I know some of the people on their strength staff, and we could have a different level of conversation about some certain things, more of like not related to the team, but like training methodology. I would ask them questions. Hey, what do you think about this? Latest research that. But I remember one time they were super excited because like, oh, we got these new sleep pod or these new float tanks. We got this, we got that. And like, man, you go to the Vikings facility, you go to the Niners facility, you go to the Bears facility, some of these teams that have put real money and resources in, and they have 10 of those things. And it's like, yeah, we got one. And it's like, oh, that's probably not ideal. Not to mention, I mean, all the complaints that we all know about with like Larry Hess and his staff and, the physical therapy and wanting to pay for certain things or not pay for certain things, surgeries, whatever, like all that stuff was a huge, huge issue. Not to mention some of the teaching techniques and tools available. I mean, Jaden in the VR, like Josh Harris didn't have to buy that for Jaden. It would have been incredibly stupid not to, and the investment is more than worth it because the amount of money that Jayden-Daniels is going to make Josh Harris over the next 10 years will far outpace the money that he's going to pay him, and presuming that Jaden continues on the track he's on, he's going to be the highest paid player in football in 4 years. Yeah. So, like, that's an investment. The VR technology is a drop in the bucket compared to what that contract. I mean, think about it. It's probably going to be a $400 million contract, at least. The way quarterback contracts are going. A couple of years from now, he's going to be making $70-80 million a year, the way the salary cap is going. So, again, the VR technology, drop in the bucket, but Josh Harris didn't have to do it. And they're like, yeah, you had this thing at LSU that made you awesome. Sick. Like, let's buy it. By the way, does anybody else want it? Like, I remember hearing a couple years ago about in the Bears facility, they have some classrooms that are actually like quarter fields, basically, and it allows them to do quasi walkthroughs with like film projected up. So it's another almost virtual reality type experience. Very cool. Because of the way the NFL rules are written, some of, like that doesn't count as field time, which is important in the relationship with the PA. And how limited they are in practice time. So there's like little things like that in how they run the operation and some of the resources that are available that I presume a lot more are available now to the coaches, to the staff, not to mention the human capital, right? You mentioned, George, that how much more flushed out this front office is. I mean, they had a one-man analytics crew for years. And that person, with all due respect to that person, like, wasn't really up to, I mean, no one's up to being a one-man analytics crew, but I don't think this was an innovator in the field. It was someone who was trying to collect very basic data and do what they could with it. And they were probably better suited or having some, I say this respectfully, nerds around who are a little more into the data. And so, Josh gets here, he hires Eugene Shen to kind of carry the bucket through the end of the Rivera era. Then they hire Ben Sosna, who's one of the absolute best in the business on that front. I was talking with Adam Amin this week when he was in. He's calling the game for Fox this weekend, but he was in town because he also does Bulls play-by-play on TV. And so he called the Bulls-Wizards game on Wednesday, and he's a good friend of mine. So we're having lunch, and I was telling him about Dave Gardy. And he's like, man, so many people are doing this now where like around the league, the best teams, the ones that are best resource have someone who is a rules and situation expert.
Yeah.
The Commanders
absolutely.
just so happened to hire one who came out of the league office and wrote half the rules. And so like they're not just getting the things that everyone else has, they're getting the deluxe versions of them, especially on the people side. And I think that probably I spent 3 minutes talking about float tanks when I could have just said like, go look at Ben Sosna and Dave Gardy, and like that's probably actually the best answer to your question.
I love it.
I think Chris Baker told me one time that they hadn't gotten a second cold tank until Robert got injured the first time. Like, imagine that. We're not.
Yeah.
I mean, that's 2012, right? We're not talking about a long ass time ago. They only had one cold tub. So just amazing there. And to your point about analytics, Craig, I saw last night the coach from Notre Dame, they had just hired the guy from PFF, and he literally just stands there next to the coach, and the coach is looking back at him like what he needs. What do I do now? Time and distance, down and distance, time left on the clock. All these guys, whether he's standing right next to him on the field or on a headset up in a booth somewhere, but every team should have one of those now. And I just remember some of the coaches we've had here in the past were just so terrible at it. And you think, just find somebody that can help get you through the time clock, please.
Well, and on top of that, like credit to Dan, because that takes humility. Because I think most people think like that's what you do as a head coach. Or your whole job is to call timeouts. Nobody gets an NFL head coaching job because they're good at calling timeouts and clock management. Like, and in fact, it's the only, unless you are the clock management guy somewhere else and then somehow turn that into a head coaching gig. And if so, well done out of you. But mostly it's the coordinators, right, who don't really have to worry about that stuff. And I think especially defensive coordinators don't have to worry about that stuff. And I think we've seen that come up. I mean, I think Raheem Morris is a pretty good coach. But what he did this past weekend with the Falcons and that clock management was heinous. And so I think a lot of defensive coaches, and obviously that's what Dan is, really struggle with that stuff because as an offensive coach, as a play caller, like you have to think about that a little bit more. Eberflus with the Bears, same thing. It's like, bro, how many times are you going to mess this up? And for a head coach to be like, you want to know what? I've never had to do this before. I'm probably not going to be that good at it. Why don't I get someone who's an expert and just have them tell me when to call timeouts? But not only that, not just have the trust of like when they tell me I do what they say, but Dan and Dave Gardy and the other people involved in those decisions have a meeting every single Friday. And there's a team version and then there's a Dan version, right? So the team version is Gardy gets up and does fairly small. All their meetings are very, very quick. I think that's a Cliff influence amongst other things, amongst other people. But team version is like, here's some odd situations that came up in the league this week or some interesting situations. I think it's like 3 to 5. I don't think they do like, here's 20 different things that happen, but like going into the end of a half, end of a quarter, end of game situation, overtime. Hey, fourth down. This is how this team handled it. This was really good. Or like, this is a team that botched it. Here's how we would handle it. And so everybody's on the same page should that situation come up. Then Dan and Dave, and I think Sosna might be involved in that. I can't remember who else is on kind of the time management team, if you will. Like they have a meeting too so that they understand this is how we manage this game. And I think we've seen changing strategies this year, right? Like we've seen some weeks where Dan, and especially lately, and I hope he stays in this mode, but it's also hard to argue because sometimes when he hasn't been super aggressive on fourth down, they've won. Think of the first Giants game, especially after Gano got hurt. They were really conservative on fourth down in that game. And even though they scored 7 field goals, they won the football game. So like I hated it, but it worked. Okay, cool. I'll take working. But like the last couple of weeks, they've kind of said, we have one of the best fourth down weapons in the league in Jaden Daniels. We're going to need to score touchdowns. We're going to be super aggressive on fourth down. And so they're prepared for those situations versus it feels like some other coaches that I covered made it up as they went and felt the vibes of the game. And vibes are a terrible way to manage a football game. Absolutely. And so I think that humility from Quinn to have people around him, empower them to do their job and then actually listen to them and not just be like, F it, I'm the head coach. We're going to do whatever I want. Thanks for all the work that you did for nothing. I think that's really, really special.
Craig, George mentioned earlier about fleshing out not only the coaching staff, but the front office, which will be important. This organization is going to start losing people, not because they suck, but because they're very good. Which is something to be said, right? That's a step in the right direction. I think we've already heard rumblings that Ben Johnson would like to take Newmark with him wherever it is that he goes next, which obviously you can see the connection there. That makes some sense. We're already hearing about Cliff Kingsbury, which of course you and I have had conversations about this. If there is any downside to hiring a defensive head coach, it's that this is kind of what happens. They had to have known this is what would happen with Kingsbury. They probably
Yep.
thought maybe not till next year. And I still think there's a good chance that it won't be until
I
the following year.
100% agree.
I
Yeah.
think Kingsbury
You
will
think so?
kind of take the Ben Johnson approach, like I can wait for the right opportunity. But there are a lot of guys down the pipeline in the organization behind Kingsbury. It doesn't make me excuse me, quite as nervous. I mean, you've got Johnson and Lynn and Blau and Pritchard. Like you're hoping that these guys are going to get the experience that you don't have to go out there and find somebody else, that you can kind of do all this stuff in-house. And I think that may be what Dan Quinn has set us up best for this year.
100%. And you have to think back to Dan's time in Atlanta to, I think, get the full shape of this.
That's right.
Mhm.
You know, Dan basically loses out in Atlanta after going to the Super Bowl, where Kyle gets hired at first by San Francisco, and you know he winds up replacing him with Sark, and that offense was actually, and that team was actually all right. That's actually the year Logan was in Atlanta, and you go back and look at it, and you're like, oh, that Atlanta team wasn't. It's not like they went insta suck. They took a couple years to go down, but there was no continuity. And Logan has told some stories on our show about how just things were so different, including just the relationship between the coach and the coordinator, or the coordinator and the quarterback. Like there were times that Matt Ryan and Kyle kind of got into it because Matt was used to, tear the page out of the playbook if I don't like the play. And sometimes Kyle would be like, no, this play works and I like it and we're going to run it and you're going to run it and it's going to work. And Matt would be like, okay. And they'd be in meetings the next year with Sark, and Sark will have worked on an install all week and whatever. And they'd get to it on whatever day. And he'd be like, so we're going to do this. And Matt would be like, no, I don't like that one. And Sark would be like, okay, never mind. And like, what an inefficient way to go. You have to have that communication. And also it's a new scheme and a new system and new verbiage and all that kind of stuff. And
Sark had his personal problems still at that point.
I think he did. I don't remember the exact timeline, but yeah, he's had a bumpy one along his journey. But I think that Dan was like, never again. And especially when you're pulling from, I mean, God, the Kyle tree has so many branches off of it. It's like, how did we mess that up? How did we not have Mike McDaniel, who was on that staff with Kyle, ready to go? Kyle wound up taking him to San Francisco, but would he have been able to do that if Dan was like, I'm going to make you OC? And so that, I think, setup of here, one, they brought a bunch of different people in. Cliff doesn't really have a tree, but they've worked together tremendously well. Two, I think they probably even know internally who's next. I wonder who it is, because I think you can obviously say Anthony Lynn has the most experience. He's been at OC before, but I would tend to think it's going to be one of the pass game guys. I would tend to think it's either Brian Johnson or Tavita. And I kind of think it would be Tavita. But
which is interesting because they gave Johnson the assistant head coach title.
Sure. And maybe that does wind up being the guy. He would probably, my order would be Tavita barely over Brian, and then Anthony, but I could make a solid argument for all three. And I think that's kind of the larger point here, is as long as they're on the same page internally and they're not going to fight each other over it and there's not going to be feelings about it, I think that's fine. And I think, like, if you're Brian Johnson and Tavita Pritchard jumps you for it, you're just going to get the next one. Like, the way Jaden's going, like, Jaden's going to get a lot of people, a lot of jobs. And that's, I think, a reality that they all realize and recognize. And, Blau too, like they convinced him to retire and become an assistant quarterbacks coach. And if Tavita gets the bump up, like, I think he becomes the quarterbacks coach, and he's been a tremendous addition to the room. I think you have to re-sign Marcus, which I can't believe I'm saying, thinking about the conversations we had when he got signed. But our guy Sam Fortier wrote a great piece about how important he's been and kind of some of the lessons that Marcus has learned along the way, and how good of a spot he's in mentally. And I think he'll sign back up in a heartbeat. So I think that the way that they've built the staff is tremendous. And I think the same thing for the front office. They're so deep in their front office that if they do lose Newmark, that would be tough for sure, because there's no doubt he's made a huge contribution. But there's other people that I think are probably in positions to step up. Adam is also so well respected. He could probably very easily hire from outside. And then I think the other thing in the more long-term way, real quickly, is they've set things up to give people promotions when eventually there's even more success. So what I mean by that is Adam Peters is the general manager. He is not the president of football operations, as far as I know. So if in 3 years they go to the NFC Championship game and someone comes knocking and is like, I want to pay you $10 million. I don't know what Adam's making now, but I'm going to assume it's not $10 million. Maybe it is. Who knows? Josh pays well. $10 million to be the president of football operations of the whatevers. Josh would be like, we'll pay you $11 million to stay here and be the same thing. So same thing if whoever the next assistant, let's say Sosna, and they want to keep him in the franchise long term, put him at the assistant GM now, and in 2 more years, you make Adam president, make Sosna the GM, and roll from there, or whatever it is. And so there's maneuverability within the job titles, which is really, really important when setting up a company. And that's kind of what they did. They basically fleshed everyone out and started over. And hopefully that's not something they have to deal with for a long time. But also, if they do, it's Josh Harris's money, not mine, and he's got plenty of it.
Hey, Craig, you kind of alluded to sustainability and having a great team for a very long time. I think one of the reasons why Washington did well this year is because Cliff Kingsbury and Jay Daniels had a great marriage. Are you worried that there will be some sort of fall off at all? Because I thought Cliff Kingsbury sets up Jay Daniels pretty successfully, makes him feel comfortable earlier in the game. So I'm kind of concerned. I'm curious of your thoughts in regard to that. And then also, is the Chicago Bears job even more appealing than Washington? Like, why would he want to go there in your opinion? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So the Jaden part first with Cliff, it's actually, I think, one of the big storylines specific to this weekend.
Okay.
I think in the Dallas game, the first time around, they went shot hunting and it didn't work. And Jaden was kind of off rhythm, off kilter the whole game. And it's one of the few games, if not the only game this year where that has really been the case. Now, in hindsight, I know I was definitely someone who was like, his rib's fine. Stop talking about it. In hindsight, his rib was definitely not fine. And so I will own that. That is my bad. Sorry if I yelled at you on the internet about it. It is very clear that in that week 11, week 12 kind of stretch that he just didn't have the snap on his throws. He couldn't move the way that he was used to. And so that also might have been part of his performance against Philly the first time around, and then obviously against Dallas. But I think that the play calling certainly had a huge influence, and getting him, some easy rhythm, quick game throws early is something that Cliff does really well. I think also it's something they probably talk about in a lot of staff meetings. And if Tavita or Brian Johnson takes over, then I would hope they would do the same thing. But it's pretty clear also, I think we need to both acknowledge that this staff is set up well from a succession plan, and that Cliff is really special. Like sometimes it can get like Jane Coaston's a really good friend of mine. She's right for the New York Times and do a bunch of sports stuff. She's now more in the politics world, but she loves to be like, Cliff is just hot and he just gets hired because he's hot. And I'm like, you can make a pretty good argument about that for a long time, but eventually you hear enough football people talk, and now getting to cover him in person this year. And I'm like, no, Cliff is a really special, like, offensive mind. He's so well respected by the other, like Sean and Kyle and all those guys and other people around the league, that it's more than a nice haircut and some blue eyes. Like there is really a depth of football knowledge, a depth of football understanding. And the thing that stuck out to me is the competitiveness of how he just never settles. He will always dig into the bag of tricks to find something to loosen up whatever's stopping them. And whether it's getting the quarterback run game going last week, which opened up the running back run game for the first time in 3 weeks, or our offense is super stagnant. Let's call a double pass or a trick play of some kind. Like, we will get you off kilter defensively, and we will find a way to score some points. And watching that competitiveness in real time has been really, really special, I think, this year. And could Brian Johnson or Tavita Pritchard or Anthony Lynn have that? Probably, but Cliff's really special in that regard. And that relationship with Jaden, I think, works really well because Jaden is also competitive as hell. And so instead of Jaden getting frustrated when things aren't going well, Cliff has answers. And on a pure, again, psychological level, that seems like a terrific match. I don't think I like the Bears job for Cliff. Now, to be fair to the Bears fan base, who I've had a very interesting relationship with, I'm sure. Perhaps my greatest piece of content of 2024 was when I decided to get incredibly petty after that game, because Bears fans were all in our comments the entire week leading up to. And I guess this is a good time to remind them that they haven't won a game since. But I think obviously Caleb's uber talented. And I am not as concerned about some of the character stuff that people put on him as a lot of other people. I just think he's competitive. I think he's been in a terrible situation. And I think, obviously, Cliff knows how to create good situations. I also think Cliff will probably have a partnership with a general manager there that is good. I would imagine that if I am a general manager candidate, I would I would want to go be the GM that helps revive Caleb Williams' career, especially in a year where like there's not a bunch of good quarterbacks in the draft. You're not Adam Peters coming to Washington with the second pick, knowing that Jaden Daniels is, or Drake May, or Bo Nix, or Michael Penix is sitting there, or one of them is gone and Caleb Williams is sitting there. It's a very, very different draft. And so if you can get Williams and Roma Dunze and, a top 10 right tackle from last year and Darnell Wright, like there's a lot of pieces in Chicago that I think are appealing. And I would imagine there would be, like, Cliff is not going somewhere unless he and the GM get along great and are very, very like-minded, because being here, he understands the importance of that. That said, I think he also understands the importance of really good ownership. And with all due respect to a 100-year-old lady and Miss McCaskey, they haven't been good ever consistently in Chicago. And that seems to be problematic. I also think that Kevin Warren, the team president, is probably impactful in ways that if I'm a new GM and head coach coming in, I don't know that I want that person there. And I don't think he's going to get fired. So even if he's like, I'll be over on the business side, I'm like, okay, buddy. I don't know about that. So short answer, no. I don't think the Chicago job would be more appealing than staying. I'm sure there's a job out there somewhere that could work. And who knows? Like, I don't think when Detroit became open that, Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell were seen as like, oh man, they're going to walk in there and turn that into a powerhouse. And they did. So you never know exactly where it's going to be, but like, I would certainly, the Jets job, hell no. The Bears job, probably no. And then we'll see what else comes open and what could be possible.
It feels like if anything happens with Kingsbury, it would be like if that Bengals job for some reason opened up, which I don't know why it would, but I keep hearing all the time that it's like a dark horse job that may open up. Like,
that's the one with
people
bad
are
ownership,
stand in
though.
line for that job.
Yeah.
Like, that's bad ownership. And part of the reason they're in the situation they're in is because they waited too long on some extensions. And now they're in the bad T. Higgins situation, and they did a really terrible job drafting. So, like, they need to, like, they're an expensive roster that is not going to have high draft picks because Joe Burrow's too good. Like, that is, it's a weird situation in Cincinnati. And the ownership is notoriously cheap. So, like, that's one that's a no-go. The Saints, like, unless you talk with Mickey Loomis, the GM there, and you become fast friends. And obviously, like, he's built some really good teams. So that's definitely not a no-go on the GM front, but you're not getting there with the new GM, and their quarterback situation's not good. And how quickly are you going to be able to get one? And so you start going down the list.
Raiders.
The Raiders.
That's a mess. Yeah, their roster's awful.
No thanks.
Are you surprised that John Gruden's name's back in the cycle?
There's no way he's getting a job.
I hear his name all the time.
Could you imagine the phone call with Roger Goodell being like, as a team owner, being like, hey, I think we're going to hire John Gruden. You're going to do what now?
Yeah.
That's what I thought, but I have heard his name with the big guns this cycle for the last couple of weeks now, and it surprised me because I thought that was definitely a no-go.
Yeah.
Craig, let's talk a little football. We'll get to the Commander. I have an interesting non-Commanders question first, though.
Okay.
It kind of ties in. What would you have done with Saquon Barkley? I mean, it feels he was so close to a record that probably he doesn't get back to it.
Oh, I thought you were asking if you were the Giants last year, which is also a fun question.
I mean, they're dummies. I think the answer is you keep Saquon Barkley for a couple extra million. I'm talking about the record that he could have gotten this week that he won't be getting, which leads me to a question about the Commanders, where they're in an interesting position to be able to sit people that Lord knows we never thought we'd see. So first, I'm curious. I understand wanting to get Saquon the record. I understand Saquon wanting to get you the record. But if he goes down, you're done as the Eagles.
Right.
I mean, I think your Super Bowl chances get flushed down the toilet. So I understand you can't play him. But how bad do you think they wanted to be able to play it for him?
I think they wanted this to be Madden and they could turn injuries off and then they'd be set. Like, you want that so badly for the player. You want that so badly, especially because Saquon's done a tremendous job of sharing that record with his offensive line. Right. I mean, look, and like, it's a reflection of Jalen Hurts. It's a reflection of their pass game. Like, it's a reflection of a lot of stuff and how good they are. It's a reflection if you're Howie Roseman, you're like, yeah, I'm the one who signed that. By the way, my quick Giants take is
Yes.
I actually still, as bad as it is, I think they made the right move. Like Saquon, the running back in general is, at best ice cream, if not topping, and the Giants don't have a bowl. So like, what's the point of having ice cream? They need to go bowl shopping. And the fact that he happened to sign with a division rival and is having a historic season is not like that would not have saved the Giants this year. So it just hurts a little extra as you watch them have a delicious Sunday. But I think ultimately you talk to Saquon and you say, how important is this to you? And if he's like, this is the most important thing in my career, I want this record so badly, I want this on my Hall of Fame plaque, then you have to think about playing him, because keeping the player happy is a part of creating a winning culture. And I know that like if a player's focused on individual records versus team success, like what does that say? Ultimately, like the teammates want to see each other succeed. And there's no doubt that every person in that locker room wants Saquon to get that record. They, of course, would feel terrible if he got it and then pulled his hamstring on the next carry, or whatever, on the, gets tripped up and twists an ankle on the carry that he breaks the record. He got it, but at what cost? Like, yeah, in hindsight, you'd feel real bad about that. And I think that's how you have to think about it. And to Saquon's credit, I think that is how he's thinking about it. He's like, man, even if I get it, if I then am hurt or I'm less than I could be, then how am I going to feel about it then? And the answer is terrible. What we're really here for is a chance at a championship. That's why I came here. Like, let's keep that in focus. And so I think kind of everyone's handled it right. I think they went to Saquon, is what it sounds like, and said, like, how important is this to you? And Saquon was like, important, but not more important than us winning. Like, shut me down. I'll see y'all in the playoffs. And I think
they would have yanked him after he got the record. So theoretically, if he's getting injured, it would have been before he got the record, which would have been a double kick to the dick. So I mean, you just gotta, I get that. Which I lead that into, the head coach for Washington has obviously said they want to win this game. They're going to go out and play for it. Lord knows there are home playoff implications, according to the head coach, by winning this game, which I think is crazy, considering also where we've come from with playoff knowledge of where this team is. I get that they want to win, but again, Five goes out there and gets injured. Let me find some wood to knock on. The season's over. You just can't have. So I guess, do they play him the whole game? Does he go up? If they can get up 2 scores in the first half, like theoretically, what is the best case scenario for Sunday?
I think the best case scenario is they play a really good first half. They're up big, and the Cowboys have clearly already said 1, 2, 3 Cancun, and then you sit them and Marcus, get back out there, buddy. Go do Carolina Part 2. Have yourself a great time. Chris Rodriguez, time to get you some carries. Luke McCaffrey, that anytime touchdown wager that Denton Day, my colleague at the Team 980, has placed literally every week of this season. It's time to get that cash out for old Double D. I think that's the best case scenario. And we actually saw that in 2015. Kirk had a couple of records to set. Week 17 then against Dallas. He had a monster first half, set the records, and then they sat him. Colt got to finish out the game, and all was well in the kingdom. But getting the 6th seed is really important. Like, getting the 6th seed and playing LA or Tampa is definitely better than having to face Philly a third time, who would be just ticked off about how the last game went for Washington and Philadelphia in Philly on the road. Like, that is not that I don't think Washington can win that game. And, a third matchup, like, who knows? You're so familiar at that point, but the way that game went the last time with Jalen getting hurt and then I'm good on that. So I would much rather have the
Rams or Bucks.
I think slightly towards the Bucks, which feels a little crazy because Baker's about to throw for 40 touchdowns, which there's like, I think he's the 10th guy ever, and the other 9 guys are like top line Hall of Famers.
Pro Bowl, Craig.
I know, which is crazy. And also, I don't know that it was who do you replace?
Wrong call. Yeah, exactly right. I agree with you. Yeah.
Mahomes didn't make it. And I was thinking, who are you going to take off? The two MVP candidates?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully Baker. I'm guessing Baker was the first alternate, and I'm guessing, if Detroit or Minnesota makes the Super Bowl, or hey, Washington makes a little run here, Jaden making the Super Bowl, then hopefully it's one of those 3 guys, and Baker can get in because he absolutely deserves it. It's just a 4-track, or 4-car race with three lanes here. So, I think I take the volatility of Tampa and where they're at defensively, and they're, especially if Winfield's not playing, like they're a totally different defense without him versus like oh, Matthew Stafford's going to turn it up to playoff Stafford, and Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp are out there, and Nacua scares the bejesus out of me.
I'm
And
right
like
there
the Rams run game, not that the Bucks run game is anything to sneeze at, dude. What they've done with how Liam Cohen's designed that thing up in the season Bucky Irving has had, holy crap! Like if Jaden and Brock Bowers didn't exist, then Bucky Irving is a top guy for offensive rookie of the year. That's kind of year he's had. So that's the problem. It's the playoffs. Like, they're all good. I'd rather face Atlanta again. That's what I would that's what I would want. But I don't know that that's going to be an option. So I think I'd prefer Tampa ever so slightly over LA. But I could see how LA also wins in a 40-20 blowout, or Washington wins that game 40-20 themselves. So as far as the sitting guys, though, I think this is mirroring the preseason conversation that we have every year, right? Do you sit guys or do you not? Do you want the rhythm? Do you want the quality of play versus do you want, to ensure that a guy doesn't get hurt? And the only way to do that is to sit them. I think the way Washington has played the last couple of weeks, I am willing to take the risk that they need to play some and hopefully play quality, because they've committed so many dumb penalties. Their execution hasn't been nearly as good. And if that's going to be the case, you're not going to win a playoff game anyway. Now, I don't want guys getting hurt. I'd rather lose a playoff game healthy than I would losing a playoff game injured. But I think that like we can't control all of those factors at once. I'd rather play well, get going, get a lead. I mean, Parsons was added to the injury report yesterday, so who knows if he even plays. He had a wrist injury and popped up on the injury report on Thursday. So if he's not playing and CD's not playing, like, you should be able to be up 28, 28-10 at least at halftime on this Cowboys team, just all due respect. But that's not a very talented roster if those two dudes aren't playing, and we know Lamb's already out. So hopefully that's on the table, and that would be the ideal situation.
I think you nailed it too. I think Washington over the past couple of weeks has committed so many turnovers, so many penalties. They need to knock the rust off and have a good first half. Speaking of health, right? I think Washington has the opportunity to walk into the playoffs with some pretty legitimate good health, right? If Marshawn Lattimore returns, Austin Eckler returns, John Allen returns, with some reps under his belt. I'm just kind of curious, who do you think will have a larger impact in the playoffs, Marshawn Lattimore, Austin Eckler, because they're both vital components of both sides of the ball. Especially play the Bucks. That Mike Evans, Marshawn Lattimore rematch will be kind of fun to watch. So just curious what your thoughts are. Exactly right. That'd be fun.
Could you imagine Lattimore is just like, welcome back. Here's Mike Evans. It's a boxing. I mean, for folks that don't know, obviously they used to play each other twice a year in the NFC South, and they basically got into a fist fight twice a year for like 3 years straight. It was actually ridiculous.
Yeah.
By the way, what is it about the NFC South with some stuff? Like Steve Smith used to have some folks down in Atlanta that he'd fight with every year.
All the time.
It's a boxing division down there. They don't play good football, but they'll fight.
Not at all.
I think it's got to be Lattimore because of also what's behind. I do think there's a way that, and I hope they settle into it this week, that Davis and St. Juste can be rotated and like coverages can be played to limit the damage if Marshawn is not there. And I think they found that for some stretches in the middle of the season too. But like Davis, I know people think that he can't do anything. Like, he's a super physical corner who actually plays the run pretty well. And so you see it in the second half against the Falcons at times, like Drake London goes out to block and Davis chins him and you have a tackle for loss. And it's like, oh, okay, that's useful. Now it'd be great if you didn't give up a 20-yard stop route and look like you had breaks. But like, okay, we'll take that. And so you get that element of it with him in the run game. And then can you play a bunch of cover two if he winds up in coverage and not have him down the field a ton? Like, use his length to make it harder to get throws up over the top of him, try to funnel things down into the flat, and then he can run and tackle or just not be involved in the play at all. So that's your cover twos, your cover sixes. He's on the cover two side of the cover six. Cover six is a half quarters, half cover two for those that don't know. And so there's some things schematically where you can avoid him being in vertical situations down the field. And then for other more obvious passing situations, Juice is the better cover corner, and then you just hope it's not a big moment and he doesn't get in his own way, because as long as he plays confidently, he's actually pretty good. The problem is Benjamin has just lost his mind at times and forgotten how to play football in the biggest of moments on repeat, which is incredibly frustrating. So I think because that is your option, is like trying to manage those two things, or just being like, okay, Marshawn Lattimore has everything. Lattimore is the bigger impact player, not to mention you can then roll safety help over to Mikey, who's had a rough couple of weeks here as well. There's just a lot more stuff you can do. You can play more man coverage and feel good about it.
Yeah.
With Lattimore. But I do think the other guy that's worth mentioning And I cannot believe, if you think back like a year ago,
Naomi Brown.
yeah, that's exactly where I was going. Like,
Yeah.
Diami is so important to this offense because without him, it is just Terry on vertical stuff. And while you could manufacture some big plays potentially with Austin, and they did a tremendous job in the first, 6-7 weeks of the season of doing that, to just not have a vertical threat is such a limiting factor for an offense. And defenses just play them so differently. And so if you can get Terry on one side and Diami on the other, and obviously Noah was that, and while he didn't have a ton of production in stats, he was 5th in the NFL in PIs when he got hurt. So he was getting chunks down the field that just didn't show up in the literal stat sheet. To have that other vertical threat is enormous. And so that is actually the guy that I probably have my biggest eye on because there is no workaround for that. Like, we just discussed the workaround for corner. They've obviously figured out a running back rotation to an extent and used like OZ and Luke and some of those guys for screens and whatever to try to recreate some of the Eckler stuff. There's no other fast guy on the roster. And so without Diami, there's a really, really limiting thing, and they got to get Terry healthy too. I mean, that ankle clearly limited him last week, but no deep threat means that defenses can really sit on the underneath stuff, and that is less than ideal.
And Diamond's been great in the screen game. Like,
yes,
you'd have never thought this, but he needs to be back next year. I don't see why you don't bring him back, and he's been great for the offense. I mean, to your point, he's fitted perfectly with this scheme.
I agree.
Craig, did you see the list I sent you?
Yes, I did. I have it in front of me here.
Let's do some of this before we get out of here. George, I'm curious your thoughts on this too.
Sure.
Best player on the team.
Yeah, you got 5 here in your tweet that you sent me, and I think that's the correct answer, which is kind of crazy because he's a rookie, and Terry McLaurin certainly would be the other guy that I think you have to mention, and those are the 2 Pro Bowlers, so cool. But I think like 5 is 4th in the NFL in total EPA. Like, that's ridiculous. Like I felt like a crazy person saying this, listening to some of the MVP discussions. And then I talked with Dan Pizzuta about this on the radio show yesterday. And I was like, where is he on your MVP ballot? And he just kind of thought about it for a second. Like, I think he's 5th. He's either 4th or 5th, depending on whether you want to put Barkley over him. But like, tell me, Lamar, Josh Allen in some order. I genuinely hope they win co-MVPs because they're that close and they both deserve it. Burrow, what he's doing is insane.
Crazy.
Barkley is rushing for 2,000 yards. Name another player that is more valuable and has had a better season statistically than Jaden.
Well, they've got a chance to win 12 games this year. How many games do they win if 5 isn't on the team? 4, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more. I mean,
5, maybe I understand that, but still, like that is.
I think they're probably like a 7-win team with like average quarterback play, right? Like they've done a lot of stuff, but also I think of that total EPA stat, about a third of it is him scrambling. So that's stuff that he's creating out of structure, and so many of that estimated points added comes because he's converted 3rd and 4th downs with his legs. Like, just made stuff happen. He's got more scramble yards than any other player in football and like some of the most in the last decade. And by the way, his stats are like line for line almost identical to Lamar's last season when he won the MVP. Now, Lamar this year's on a whole different level, which is just bananas. But like Jaden is having an MVP caliber season based off the fact that his numbers look almost identical to Lamar's last year when Lamar won MVP. So yeah, I'll say 5's the best player.
If you want to score points, hire Todd Monken. What he's done with that Ravens offense. Listen, he's very good. The kid's very good, no doubt about that. But Todd Monken has done something different with that team. Georgia let me down last night. Unsung hero for the team. I have Tyler Biadasz.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I think that's a great call. Because I think that you see when he's out, like not only is Dieter not as good of a player, but like the rest of the offensive line does not play as well because they're not as organized. Things are just not as smooth. The timing is off. And some of that is Dieter's had to come in for Biadasz mid-game, so it's not like he's gotten reps during the week, but still, there's such a significant drop-off. I think the other guy that it's hard to feel like this guy's an unsung hero, but like I think people thought Bobby Wagner was washed, which is silly because I think he led the NFL in tackles last year. But like, I don't know that his impact will be fully appreciated until the It's a Football Life Jaden Daniels is told 20 years from now, where we understand how much he really meant to Jaden. Not to mention the organizational, leadership that he has throughout the entire team, but especially on that defense. So I'd say him, Ertz as a safety blanket. I think, again, people thought he was washed, like that he's worth mentioning. But I think Biotish, but the nature of offensive line play, nobody cares. But we should care. Go Tyler Biotish. I like that one, Doug.
You bringing Ertz and Wagner back next year, if it's your call?
Wagner, yes. Ertz,
Draft.
it depends on what else I can do, which I feel bad saying because Zach has done so many things right, and I can make a case for it for sure. But like, what's he doing to the growth of Sinnott? Like, is Ben Sinnott's problem, or is a bigger role Ben Sinnott's problem? And then what else can you do as a pass catching tight end in free agency or in the draft?
You more surprised by the lack of productivity from Sinnott or McCaffrey?
Sinnott. Yeah, I mean, in part just because he's a higher pick and he's also had less production. I feel like he's had some nice blocks at times this year, but like he's a guy that was supposed to be a pretty good pass catching weapon, and he just is not a consistent route runner. It seems like Five doesn't really trust him. Like there's times where you're like, you probably should throw that, and like if it happens once, it's like, oh, he missed the read. If it's happening for 17 weeks, it's like, yeah, he doesn't trust that guy to finish the play. So we got to get that fixed in the offseason. But hey. Not everything's perfect. That's fine. It's the NFL.
I didn't make the list. I kind of hated doing this one, but the next one was most disappointing. I put Dorrance Armstrong just because he was like the one big money if you want to call it big money, but I think they gave him 4 years at like $15 million a year. I think it was like basically what they spent their money on. And he hasn't given up he hadn't had quite the production that I thought he'd had. Or certainly what they thought they had by doing that. Are you pulling up the contract there, Craig?
Yeah, it's it was 3 for 33, so not quite that much money, which probably impacts how you feel a little bit, I'm guessing.
A little bit. But still, I mean, of all the guys they've had, I expected more out of him, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's been okay this year. I know the stats are not huge. I'm trying to look up total. What's his sack number? He's got 5, which is obviously not great. He did miss a little bit of time. I think it's also just hard, like if you're the premier pass rusher, which he should not be on any team, but he is on this one outside of Frankie Louvu. So, yeah, I think Dorrance has just been solid. So it's hard for me to be like, oh, he's really disappointing when like he's by and large done his job, and I never expected him to be like a super stud. And like at $11 million a year, like if you're a really solid player at that position, like I can live with that. I mean, I think
Dante Fowler outplayed him this year, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Dante Fowler actually outplayed him. Would you bring him back, Greg? What do you think about that?
Fowler?
Yeah.
I would definitely consider it. My question is like in what, like I don't want Fowler in the same role and I want Armstrong in the same role. Like not my number one, but like in my top 5 for sure. In everybody's top 5. This is not an original thought of like, what do you need for next year is you need a premier pass rusher, like an actual high end edge guy. I think Sinnott has to be in the conversation, which I feel bad because he's a rookie, but like he was a 2nd round pick and he hadn't really done a whole lot. So I think that, some people want to put that on the coaches and be like, oh, he needs more opportunity. Like they have every incentive in the world to give him every opportunity in the world. Like clearly it's something about the way he's operating. And that's not to say that he's a bust or a failure because it's year 1 and some guys take a little bit longer and he's a young player. And I think he was fairly young for his draft class and everything. Like I think he's only like 21 or 22 years old. It's not like he's Jaden coming in at 23, nearly 24. So I think that we should have some patience there. But in terms of this season, you'd certainly hope a 2nd round pick. And that's, by the way, nixing out all the guys that aren't even here anymore. Like they cut 3 first round picks during the season. Pick any of those guys over Dorrance Armstrong, and I'm perfectly happy with that.
Craig, you don't give Sinnott any grace, though. I feel like so with him, watching film with Mark Bullock, I feel like he was a great H-back. He was a great contributor in the run game. So I give Ben Sinnott some credence in regard to that. And then also Washington played a lot of 12 personnel. They seem to like favor John Bates in regard to blocking. So maybe he didn't have the opportunity. How do you feel about that? Like I mean,
Bates is the better blocker, right? Like Bates is I would say premier level blocking tight end.
Yeah.
Like he's not giving you a ton in the pass game. He's not dynamic, but like holy cow, will that guy put a face mask on you? And like Logan has talked about his definition for a true wide tight end is like, can I on a play, especially off a play action fake, trust you to block a defensive end one-on-one? Like that's big boy blocking. And John Bates can do that. Ben Sinnott, I'm not trusting you to do that yet. And so, like, he's kind of more in the hybrid. Like, he's done some nice things in the run game. He also will occasionally go the wrong way in the run game because he's a rookie and it happens. And so, I think the lack of consistency, and I think that the hard part about Sinnott for me is it hasn't really gotten better. He's just kind of been inconsistent, up and down. Don't know what you're going to get all year. I would have liked to see a more steady progression from him. But I'm also, again, it's not about not giving him grace necessarily, because I'm not writing him off in the long term. It's just you would have hoped that for season 1, you would have gotten a little bit more out of him. I think that's probably where I stand. But again, like the fact that Forbes and Dotson specifically couldn't get with the program, considering how good the program is, like that to me is biggest disappointment of the year. And that's, to be very clear, on the players, not on the program. Jamin was always fighting an uphill battle. I almost feel bad for Jamin, but for Dotson and Forbes specifically, like they needed you and couldn't get it done.
Not that it matters, but as we're talking about guys that have been jettisoned from the organization, Phil Mathis got let go, and I thought he was having his best year yet as a commander.
George. I will say, like, if you want to say a mistake that perhaps Adam made, and how significant is this? Whatever. I think in hindsight, you would have kept Ridgeway as opposed to Mathis, but because he'd have a good year with New Orleans. But I get it. Like Big Phil, they clearly need his body type. The problem is they had to go find it in Carl Davis, and that's again more about Big Phil than it is clearly everyone else who's on board with this coaching and having career years.
On my list, I gave the defensive player of the year to Bobby Wagner.
I would probably go Luvu.
A lot of people went Luvu. I get that.
Yeah, Bobby's having a terrific year. But I think Frankie, his versatility. I was reading some stat on Next Gen Stats the other day that was basically like, he's the only one of only like 2 players to have X number of snaps as a pass rusher, X in coverage, and X as an off-ball linebacker and run defense. Like his versatility allows for them to be in different personnel groupings without actually changing the humans on the field. And sometimes that's really cool to watch Joe Witt operate in that way.
I agree.
I have offensive player of the year, Jaden Daniels.
No, because we're going to make this like MVP, where MVP is the quarterback award. I agree. We need something to go to Terry McLaurin. Obviously, Jaden's the correct answer if you're purely offensive player of the year. But I will go with the quarterbacks, or in this case, best player goes to the quarterback, and the non-quarterback award becomes the offensive player of the year. And so, Terry, congratulations! I got you a trophy.
That I got a lot of that in the replies. Like, we got to find something to give to Terry because he's just been having a fantastic year.
Yeah, for sure.
And then this one got a lot of debate on the post. Your favorite moment for me, it was the overtime winner.
Yeah, I mean that one was great because you have playoffs as well. I think I'm gonna have to go with the Hail Mary. The funny thing is, it would have been honestly, for a very singular moment, if I can isolate it and forget what happens after. The Terry touchdown against Dallas, because it happened right after the Hail Mary. And I just remember looking at David Aldridge in the press box being like, can you believe this? Like, you're David Aldridge. You've covered everything. Like, you're in the hall. You're literally in the Basketball Hall of Fame, and you've been doing this for a bunch. Like, how lucky are we? And then
Team of Destiny
misses the extra point. It's like, whoa, whoops. That is my singular moment, that Terry touchdown against Dallas. But I think because of how the context that we know exists around it, I probably then default to the Hail Mary.
I was in-house for both of those games, and the fact that so for one, that Cowboys game, I felt that Team of Destiny aura that was coming about it, and it was such a big drop-off from pure jubilation to just anger immediately.
Yeah.
That Bears Hail Mary, seeing that live. My family's from Chicago. My wife's family's from Chicago, so they're texting me talking trash. So going from about to lose the game to a Hail Mary win, I will never forget it. Moment in time.
Yeah.
Core memory.
Real quickly, Craig, before we get out of here, and I hate to even bring up the future as we're sitting in such a great present, but I'm curious your thoughts. Jaden has had such an incredible year. Like, how do you not get into a sophomore slump, quote unquote, if your freshman season has broken almost every record there is to break? How do we gear ourselves for what has to be some sort of a step back, right? I mean,
I think you look at Stroud, right, and you go like, there's probably going to be something. One, I think organizationally they have to do a better job than Houston did. Houston ignored a lot of red flags, and those have bitten them in the butt. But I think this organization has been very realistic about who they are, and I appreciate that about them. I think for Jaden, he's got to keep doing what he's doing. His work ethic is part of why he's so special. Keep on doing what you're doing. And I know that's like a lame coach answer, but like it's the correct one. Just Jaden, keep showing up at 4:30 in the morning, do your walkthroughs, do the things, connect with if it's Cliff or if someone else, like have that same exact thing. And then it's on as much as it is on Jaden and the roster building, like it's on the staff to make sure that they stay a step ahead. And, I think that's the really cool thing about watching, say, Lamar in the second year of Todd Monken's offense is like, they built on what it was. And so, can you continually build on what you've done in year one? And if so, I think you can avoid that because you do have a much, much harder schedule next year. Both you're playing second place teams and you're facing, I think it's the AFC West and the NFC North. So, whoo, buddy, that is a tough one.
Prepared to stay up late a lot next year, aren't we?
Don't remind me. Don't remind me. Someone who does an instant reaction post-game show.
Greg, I got one more question for you before we take off. So I think it's so important for that next step with Jaden is to insulate him with some support, right? So whether wide receiver or running
I'm really
back.
sorry, guys, but I don't know if you saw the private chat. I have to go because I'm getting a call from Richmond from AWOD's show. So we can wrap up, do a quick wrap or whatever that you guys can edit together. But I gotta take this.
No, you're good. Thanks, buddy. Appreciate you.
Yeah, sorry about that. All right, see you guys.
No, you're good,
brother. Peace.
Bye.